Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Analytics Continuity During GDPR via Data Masking. My name is Julian Mancier. I am a solutions engineer with Progress based out of our Raleigh, North Carolina office. I'm also joined across the pond in the UK by my good friend Rod Welch. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, Julian. I'm Rod Welch. I'm a BI consultant, specializes in GDPR and MI systems. I'm currently contracted to LV Insurance Company here in UK on a GDPR project.
So I connected with Rod very recently. With his experience in GDPR and BI, I also have a background in security, so we thought it was an appropriate approach to talk a little bit through what folks can do today in terms of dealing with data masking and the issues around GDPR with business intelligence. But I'm going to hand it over to Rod, who's going to start the agenda and start the beginning of the topics.
Okay, thanks, Julian. Yes, in our webinar today, we will cover the following items. First of all, I will start with a brief introduction to GDPR. We look at the impact of GDPR on data analytics and business intelligence systems. Then go on to leveraging data masking for analytics continuity. I will then hand over to Julian, who will cover security best practices for data masking, and follow that by a live demo showing an example of data masking in practice. As Julian mentioned, we shall have time at the end for a Q&A session. Yeah, so what is GDPR? Now, the General Data Protection Regulation, commonly known as GDPR, was ratified back in April 2016 and came into effect on May the 25th last year. Now, this law harmonized and strengthened consumer data protection across the European Union. The law is all about the rights of the EU citizen regarding their personal data held or processed by organizations. Now, today, we will focus on two main areas of GDPR that have a direct impact on data analytics. And first of all, that's data minimization, which states that data must be relevant, adequate, and limited to the purposes for which it is required to manage the business processes. And the second part, storage limitations, commonly referred to as data retention. Now, this refers to the rule that personal data may be kept for only as long as required to perform the necessary business processes. Now, these two clauses encourage organizations to minimize by removing or anonymizing personal data that is no longer required, and to restrict access to personal data to only those who need it to perform their business duties. Now, in GDPR, we frequently refer to PII. So what is considered PII? PII, or personally identifiable information, is defined under Article 4 of GDPR, meaning any information related to an identified or identifiable natural person is also known as a data subject. Now, this is essentially any piece of information or data that can identify an individual. And that is apart from the person's name. Other examples of PII data are, the home address, email address, biometric data, social security or British national insurance number, IP address, etc. Now, any of these data items could point to an individual and therefore fall under GDPR rules. Now let's take a look at the impact of GDPR on data analytics and MI systems. Now, anyone working in the field of business intelligence or data analytics are familiar with the fact that customer data is a very rich source for demographic and purchasing analysis. With GDPR, this raises a problem. Sales and marketing teams will be disadvantaged without access to this rich source for analyzing customers' purchasing behavior. Now, without which, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to set competitive prices or develop marketable products. Data teams need large volumes of historical and real-time data, and traditionally, data analysts and data warehouse engineers try to grab as much data as they can from source systems and avoid the need for a second trip back to the source. Now, couple this with the need for a rich source of historical data, essential for analyzing trends, forecasting, and pricing modeling. Data teams need large volumes of this data. Now, this immediately puts data analysts at odds with the constructs of GDPR, which hold corporations to only keeping sufficient personal data to satisfy their justifiable business needs and no more. So the old adage that business analysts and data analysts used to say, just give me as much data as you have, give me it all. Those days are now kind of numbered, because you have to be very careful in terms of what data you're taking, who has access to that data, and how long you're keeping that data. Now, furthermore, other departments such as complaints and fraud detection teams will still need access to customer data. An example, local and international compliance laws require companies to supply data to confirm that they have the capacity to satisfy customers' legal rights and are operating fairly. In addition, many corporations have processes in place to detect potential fraud. Now, these use cases frequently require the storage of personal data, including names, telephone numbers, and even bank account details, and restore that data over a historical period. Now, allowing one group access to such personal data while denying others could cause an organization to rewrite many of its IT systems. However, by dynamically masking PII items depending on the employee's role, existing systems and reports can continue without the need for amendment. So let's see how leveraging data masking can enable analytics continuity post GDPR. Now, as I mentioned earlier, organizations can retain specific personal data if they have a legitimate business case, because GDPR was not designed to prevent organizations from carrying out their normal business operations. However, where the business has a legitimate reason for storing and processing personal data, they must know what personal data they are storing, set a time limit for how long they require that personal data, and adhere to that time limit. Now, setting a limit on how long data can be retained is problematic for data analysts, as they frequently require access to historical data, sometimes dating back decades, in order to identify trends and managing risk. Therefore, deleting data is not an easy option. Instead, many corporations are opting to anonymize historical data after it has passed its legitimate retention period. Now, under GDPR, anonymous data is not subject to retention restrictions. If personal data is anonymized to the extent that an individual cannot be identified, then it is no longer subject to GDPR and can be retained. Now, this can be as simple as removing a person's name, address, telephone number, etc. from the data source. Now, with data masking, companies have the ability to render personal data anonymous, thereby rendering it GDPR compliant and not subject to retention restrictions. So I'll pass you on now to Julian, who will talk about security best practices regarding data retention and obfuscation.
Thanks, Rod. This is, by no means an extensive list. Saying that there are just a few things that we can suggest in terms of security is a little bit narrow-minded, but security is such a broad field that it's hard to say one specific area. What we have here are basically best practices around compliance, specifically around things like GDPR or HIPAA or whatever it may be. So The first thing that I've seen in the industry is, really lawyers and your security operation teams are the compliance experts, not DBAs. And what I mean by this is that, the folks who are really cued into who should have access to what are not the technical folks who, would know how to alter an access control list or an ACL. So it takes a lot of time for folks to adjust these ACLs and to get it to the point where they are compliant. You might have to work directly with the DBA. You might have to create an IT ticket to make, a change in access. The problem is a lot of times these changes over time are not monitored, and it can create something known as privilege creep. There might be a time where a specific user is being pulled onto a special project, which we want to give them maybe an extra month of higher privilege to the data, given the project that they're doing. Well, in the ideal world, that user's privilege would go back to its original setting once that project is complete. But we don't see that. We see where that privilege just stays the same. So that's what's known as sort of privilege creep. You can also get something as sort of a form of shadow IT where folks will find a way to create an admin user that has access to all the data. And if an admin, a true admin does not necessarily know to look out for other admins that are created, then you have basically a form of shadow IT where a user is created that really shouldn't have access to the data that they do. And strong encryption is a must. I think today encryption is in many ways sort of a checkbox, but I think there's ways that it can be used that goes above and beyond what that checkbox requirement is. In the case like what Rod was saying, that deletion is really just not acceptable. You want to use strong encryption with, limited key access. But this is going beyond the idea of always encrypted mechanisms that databases have today. That's the idea where data at rest has to be encrypted. That's a checkbox. That everyone has to have that today. What the real value here in terms of strong encryption is for those users or those roles that do not need access to specific data, we're going to encrypt that data in real time such that it is impossible for them to get access to that data. And we'll see an example of that here in the demo. But the idea being that, there are times where you want to keep the data and you want to make sure that data stays around for, future need. But if it's over a certain age, you want to make sure that basically no one except for maybe admins have access to that data. So I'm going to do a quick demo. This is sort of a smaller piece of a larger demo that I'm working on, which includes many different aspects in terms of security, but I focus it just on that access control list. And the scenario is this. We have Acme Insurance, who's a global insurance company based in New York. The company started in the late 1990s. That point is not so much as important as just to say that, there's going to be data that's relatively old. And internal to this Acme company is groups like risk and fraud and, other groups that you would expect inside of an insurance company. And as of today, all users authorize to the data or have access to the data via BI tool have access to all data. I understand that this is sort of worst case scenario, but I don't think it's necessarily that unrealistic to think that there are situations where basically a user is given an admin access to the database when they really don't need it. There's also an identified need to anonymize data for closed claims that are older than 10 years old. So once the claim is closed, you maybe have access to it for 3 to 5 years. In this case, we're going to say anything that's older than 10 years, we're going to fully encrypt beyond just the encryption at rest, meaning that all users except for admins or those who have a specific key do not have access to those data sets. So let's meet our internal users. And again, this is all fictitious. This is not any customers or anything that we work with at Progress. So we have Alice and Bob. Alice is a senior risk advisor working in the risk management group, which is under the InfoSec group. And Alice has responsibility for the entire globe. Now, Bob's a fraud analyst in the fraud group under legal, but Bob's based in the UK and only really has access or really only has jurisdiction over the EMEA customers. So as we see today, and this is, sort of meant to be an eye chart in a sense that both users have access to all the data. And I guess a small caveat here. I know I put social security number. That's mainly just because I'm based here in the United States. If we have any folks who are outside of the United States, you can sort of, replace this with whatever your national identification number is. So let's focus on Alice a little bit. In her role, it's probably not that necessary that she needs to know what the specific name is. And so we really want to set a policy that says, Alice, we're going to mask all the names for your data access. She also does not necessarily need to know social security numbers. So we're going to go ahead and mask those as well. So we see that we've changed a little bit in terms of having full access to having a subset of access and having some of that masked. Now with Bob, we want to remember that he's based in EMEA. And so things like social security number and addresses that are not necessarily based in EMEA, we want to be able to put some sort of policy around that says he doesn't need access to social security numbers and really only needs access to the addresses that are based in EMEA. So we'll put a policy around basically masking or even just preventing him to see any data that's for an address that's outside of his region. So if you go back to that first slide, this is basically a slimmed down version where we want to be able to mask certain information. But we also know that there is this project that says that, claims that are older than 10 years old, we really want to encrypt. So we see that first line, that first row is a relatively new closed claim date. We've masked the social security number. And then when each user, in the case, let's say Alice, reaches out for name, it's going to be masked. But let's focus on this older claim. Because it's older than 10 years old, we're going to go ahead and fully encrypt it. And this is, again, a separate encryption beyond just the database encryption for data at rest. So there might be a small group of administrators or whoever it may be that actually has access to this data, but for everyone else, this is always going to stay encrypted. So let's see this. I'm going to use Tableau, but let's see this in real life. And I am going to just focus here on Alice, meaning the masked name, masked social security, and encrypted. And I'm going to jump into Tableau. So I already have the service running. This is a tool at Progress known Open Access, which is an SDK to help connect to many different types of data sources. But I basically configured it such that it adds these policies that allow users to adjust the policy for each individual user. So I'm going to log into this. I've already created a data source called GDPR. I'm going to connect, and I'm going to say, okay, this is Alice. Alice has a very strong password, which is password. And I wanted to highlight here, we have a custom flag, which is saying, show encrypted as false. So we want it to basically filter out any of the rows that are seen as being encrypted. And so we have access to this client data with the name, the address. This is the same thing we saw in the PowerPoint. And if I update now, because of Alice's role, we have the names being masked, social security is being masked, but everything else is pretty much the same. You'll notice, though, that nothing here is actually older than 10 years old, and that's because of that flag that we set. You can also see that we have about 547 rows coming back. Now, there might be an actual use case where Alice wants to do some sort of calculation based on the total number of users, regardless of if it's encrypted or not. So we can still have her see that by just changing that flag to say, now we want to say that show encrypted is equal to true. So if I refresh this data set, we're now going to get the entire data set back, the entire 1,000 rows, but we have these encrypted rows for the ones that are older than 10 years old. Now, I know that this is sort of a very high level, very basic, simplified version, but there are resources out there, including those that are offered by Progress, which can help make it easier for the folks who are not necessarily technical adjust to make sure that these users are compliant. And so that's going to be sort of the longer term goal of this demo, which we have in future sessions, basically, where we dive a little bit more into the technical of how we were able to do this. But essentially, we can see, as you know, from Alice's standpoint, we can do the analytics that we need to do, and not necessarily have to worry about things like names. She doesn't have to necessarily create her own filters or do anything else. It's all being done for her at the back end. I'm going to jump back into the slides real quick. A little bit of a wrap up. So this type of access control is known as attribute-based access control, meaning that, yes, we take the user's role into consideration, but we look at other attributes, things like location, time of day, normal access pattern, whether it's read or write. The list can go on and on. We would have the ability to say, well, look, Bob's based in EMEA. If he's requesting data in a US-based database at 2 a.m. his time, we're going to say, you know what, you don't need access to that. So there's a lot of different granular access attributes that you can set for these users that can make it easier to basically control who has access to what. And that last little next step here is I do want to add, and I'm going to add the ability to basically say, hey, Alice is working on this project. She needs access to all that encrypted data. So the administrator will create a one-time passcode that she will set during the connection that will basically give her access to all the decrypted older claims for a given time period. So we can set that to a day, a week, a month, and this is all going to be set using a tool and a user interface that essentially makes it easier for those, again, like the lawyers and the security ops folks who are not necessarily the technical folks with control over the DBA. So with that, we're actually going to wrap up and do a little bit of Q&A. A few things that come up to the top of my mind that usually come up when I have conversation with folks is what to be concerned about, I guess, in terms of setting the accurate or correct policies, where to get more information about GDPR, things about maybe performance of the solution. So there's a lot of gray area in security. Rod had that slide that basically showed that PII can definitely be sort of a mixed bag of information. It's hard to necessarily tell there's nothing defining today that says this is PII, this is not, other than things like name and email. There are a lot of sort of best practices out there. I would always push. I know Rod's more on the BI side. I'm more on the security side. So I will always push to say, restrict as much as possible. It's easier to come back to and set a different policy. It's always easier to loosen up the policy versus making it tighter, especially when if a user is building reports based on what access they have. It's always easier to basically grant more. But again, I'm also coming from the security side, tend to be a little bit more pessimistic. But
yes, I do agree with you on that, Judy, and particularly that's why a lot of companies steer clear of actually deleting data, because once you've deleted it, you've lost it, and you can't come back from that. So that's why companies are looking at ways of anonymizing the data, and also companies are nervous even when you non-anonymize data. You can break things, because if you go in and start anonymize something, you find a system downstream of you might need that particular data you've just anonymized. So it's nice if you can actually turn it on and off, provided, of course, it's secure, and that's the key.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing I wanted to bring up too is there's always a worry about performance, and I'm very aware that some of these data sets are probably very massive, and my 5-column, 1,000-row example is not going to be realistic, but performance is always going to be an issue. And by adding sort of the complexity that we have here, what do we see in terms of performance? But realistically, and I've worked on with a lot of banks and insurance companies who have these very, very strict policies in terms of access. Until you start actually decrypting the rows that we encrypt that are for the old claims, the access patterns are really such that we don't see that much of a degradation in performance. Now, when you do get to the point where say, hey, I need to run this report, I need access to all the encrypted data, obviously you're going to get a performance hit there. But theoretically, those if you don't have access to that unencrypted data, that probably means that you're not going to necessarily have to run that report often, or it might even be one time. And so, long-term performance issues don't concern those kind of users as much as, having to do it every single time. So basically, if you're finding a user that says, hey, I need access to this data that's encrypted every single day, then maybe you should consider promoting that person's policy such that they have access to it. Because then you don't necessarily have to run the issue of that decrypting. We did have one one question come in, or have two questions come in. So business email regarded as PII, and I think the answer to that is yes. Especially given that in a lot of cases, like in my example, I have two emails for work. One's Julian.Mancier, which is, I'm pretty sure I'm the only Julian Mancier in the world, and J Mancier, which from that point is also pretty easy to find out who I am. So that's 100%, I think, considered PII. We have one that came in. Can you speak to application level changes, meaning new viewing functions are now needed to support the same features as your demo on the reporting side? Let me try to understand that a little better. So new viewing functions are now needed to support the same. So it looks like, Mark, you had a question come in. Can you kind of maybe be a little bit more detailed in that question? I'm trying to, not really understanding quite what you're asking. And I'll come back to that because we have another question that came in. Is it possible to mass data that still looks realistic to populate non-production environments? Yes, that's a very good question. And in fact, Jeremy, you should join my future demos because, again, this is a smaller set of my entire demo where we actually, for development purposes and for the case of wanting to build reports or when reports are in sort of development, I basically have a functionality such that it reaches out to a data mocking service called Mockaroo. If you're not familiar with Mockaroo and you need fake data, it's an excellent service. We are in no part, tied back to Mockaroo, so I'm very happy to say that, it is worth the money. They do have a free version that works very well too. And there's an API such that my tool will say, look, I need someone's name. It needs to be fake. So I reach out to their API and say, give me, 100,000 fake names. And I use that to populate. So that is 100% possible to make sort of realistic fake air quotes data for sort of non-production environments. Good question. So it says, I see new viewing features on user interfaces to support mask encrypting that is role-based and time-based. Your demo is more about the reporting user interface versus a true business application. Is that a DB feature? It can be. There are, definitely a lot of application layers that can be built on top of data sources. I think the way that the industry is going is building some sort of API layer on top of the data, which can help control and do some business logic around who has access to what, and you can also do masking. The downside of that is kind of twofold. One, a lot of BI tools don't work with APIs, and not APIs, with BI tools. So if you wanted to use, let's say, like a Tableau or a Power BI, or whatever your BI tool is, against an API, it becomes a little bit restricted. And so that's where sort of the value of using ODBC or JDBC to plug into those tools. The other piece of that is we really want to, and it's not necessarily something I could have covered in the amount of time today, but a part of the demo is the ability for those non-technical compliance experts to make real-time adjustments to those policies, such that we can essentially, and this is something, Mark, if you want to reach out to me offline, basically we have a tool that allows to create a rule set. It's a rules engine, and so it's built such that non-technical folks can build things that are seemingly technical. And that's what's actually interfacing with the open access tool, which I just showed a few minutes ago. And it makes it really, really easy, again, for like lawyers and security ops and auditing teams to make changes in real time to that. They don't have to necessarily involve, DBAs and technical people. And the second part of your question too is also, we focus on the reporting, but with business application, is it true? I would say yes. I think generally data quality tends to be a little bit more important for BI and for reporting because you don't necessarily want to have that encrypted or the mass data. With the business application, there are some things that you can do to help with data cleansing in real time. So it really shouldn't be as much of an issue with the application. But I think in terms of the rules, in terms of who has access or does even this application, I guess it's the end user of that application. Do they have access to that data? That holds true. And Mark, I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about this more in person. Feel free to reach out to me. We got another question that came in. How do you deal with the situation where the PII is linking keys such as login ID? So I guess this is the idea of, and maybe this is linked back to your previous question about the business email. There are some, and Rod, correct me if I'm wrong, there are some explicit, basically flexibility in terms of PII of business users internal to the company, basically meaning that if your login is, if you're logging into Salesforce or something like that, or whatever that login may be, if you're working for the company, I think you give up some of the rights in terms of what's considered a PII. Now, if you're saying to log in from an end user standpoint, how do you track that? Really, in the perfect world, the back end that's dealing with your login should not actually be dealing with your direct plain text login. It should actually be a hash. And what I mean by that is, there are some mathematical functions that are out there that basically scramble in such a way any information such that there's really only one possible outcome of this, but it's impossible to reverse engineer a hash to get the login. So best practices for application development is once a user hits login, it creates a hash of the user and password and sends that hash to the server of the application, and then the database containing that login ID should also be the hash. So you should never actually be passing the live plain text login.
Yes, and as you mentioned, June, as well, that there's some sort of leeway there in terms of using business email addresses. It's normally accepted if it's a business address that it's not so much PII there because it's corporate. But obviously, if someone's using their personal email address, that's a different kettle of fish.
Right. Let's say as a follow-up to points at the president where I work, this ID is used to join data across myriad systems. So if you need to anonymize this, would you need to map it? That is a really good question, Jeremy. I don't know if I know the answer to this, and this is something that maybe we can talk about offline, and it may be a situation that's unique, and there may be solutions out there, but off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure. Very good question, though. Also, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone else after the webinar. So again, I'll make sure that my email, my information, my PII email will be attached to the email that gets sent out to all the attendees. So if you think of something down the road, or if you were maybe just a little too shy to talk about it, that's fine too. I'm more than happy to talk through security, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be limited to this GDPR and business intelligence. It's sort of a security geek, and I like to talk about a lot of it. So if there are any other aspects of security that interest you, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk about it and talk about maybe any sort of best practices or resources that even if we don't necessarily have access to or resources that will help you, I can put you in touch with friends and folks at other companies that might be able to help you. All right, folks, at this time, we're going to end the webinar. Thanks for your time, and hope this was very informative. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks, and have a great day.